Hello, it's me again. I'm reading a short extract from What Could Possibly Go Wrong and a short introduction just to set the scene and let you know what's happening. Max and Markham are pursuing a trainee, Laurence Hoyle, who's jumped to Bosworth Field to attempt to change the course of history. For those of you who may be slightly confused by Max wearing a Victorian bonnet to a battle in 1485, she's also wearing Atherton's trousers. Read the book to find out why. So here we go. We needed to get a move on, however. At the moment, Henry Tudor was safely ensconced at the rear of his forces, but the moment he emerged to call on the Stanleys for support, he was vulnerable. We had to find and neutralize Hoyle, because if we didn't, then history would take us all out. I pulled Markham to the ground. If you were Hoyle, where would you go? Higher ground, if I could, to see what's going on and get my bearings. Yes, said Atherton. He's stopped. You're 2 o'clock, between 30 and 50 yards. Copy that, said Markham. We set off again, crawling with a little more speed now. The ground was firmer and drier. We were moving away from the safety of the marshland. You need to hurry, said Atherton urgently. Henry's army is opening ranks. He's on the move towards the Stanleys. And so was Richard. We could hear the horns shouted orders as Richard gathered his knights around him for that final, gallant, doomed, hopeless charge at Henry. He would so nearly get there, but nearly was not good enough. We must move now, I said, frantic with anxiety. Hoyle will attack Henry before Richard loses his horse. Just wait until Hoyle's attention is on what is happening. We inched forwards. Viewing a battle at ankle height is one of the scariest things I've ever done. I kept thinking, what would happen if the tide of fighting suddenly turned in our direction? Everything out there would just sweep straight over the top of us. There, said Markham, and there was Hoyle, crouching in a stand of stunted, waterlogged birches, craning his head left and right, looking for his target. Surely he's too far away, I said. He can't have a range of much more than 20 yards. And even as the words left my mouth, Hoyle stood up and began to run towards the fighting. Markham muttered a curse that made the air bubble around us and set off after him. I embellished the curse and set off after him. I'd say we flung caution to the wind, but that implies we'd been acting with caution in the first place. There are many words to describe the actions of two idiots crawling through a major battlefield in search of a fanatic with a gun, but believe me, cautious is not one of them. Markham pulled away from me. I'm not a sprinter. I dared not even spare a glance for what was going on around me. I ran after Markham, who ran after Hoyle, who ran towards Henry, who was galloping towards Lord Stanley. And then everything happened all at once. The king's forces swept down in a tidal wave of thundering horses, wild-eyed horses, and armoured knights, their arms rising and falling as they slaughtered everything around them, pounding after the king's banner as Richard tore towards his enemy. They were unstoppable. Shouting incoherently, Henry's escort broke up in confusion. At the head of the charge, Richard himself, easily recognisable by the crown on his helmet, bore down on Henry Tudor. Men and horses scattered before him, and even though I knew how this would end, for one treacherous moment I honestly thought Richard was going to be successful, that he would actually reach Henry after all, and the entire course of history would be changed. Henry's bodyguard moved to surround him. Not a warrior Plantagenet, he was hiding behind them, making no move to engage the enemy in personal combat. Not so Richard, who was well to the front of the charge, falling upon Henry's standard-bearer, Sir William Brandon, with such ferocity that he shattered his own lance. At that moment, Only one person stood between the king and his target, and that was the gigantic Sir John Chain, one of Henry's bodyguards, at 6 foot 8 inches tall, easily the biggest man on the battlefield, and probably in all of England as well. In one smooth movement, Richard wheeled about and, using the momentum of his horse, slammed the remains of his lance into Sir John's head, striking with such vigour that both Sir John and his horse crashed to the ground. And there he was, Henry Tudor, alone, exposed, vulnerable. With a roar that was audible even over the clamour of battle, Richard drew his sword and charged. And then, just as he was poised to fall upon Henry, to overrun his small force, when victory was literally within his grasp, the Stanleys finally made up their minds. Trumpets sounded. With a roar that drowned out everything happening around us, the front ranks began to move, smashing into Richard's tiny force from the rear. It is very possible that until that moment, Lord Stanley himself had no idea which army he would commit his support. To Richard's threat to execute Stanley's son unless he joined the attack on Henry, Stanley had contemptuously replied that he had other sons. When Henry sent messages asking for his aid, he had returned a vague response, refusing to commit himself either way. Now, with Richard far from his own lines, isolated and vulnerable, he had seen his chance. With his actions, suddenly the tide of battle turned. Things went very bad, very quickly. The fighting was brutal. Everyone out there today had everything to lose. No quarter was asked, and certainly none was given. The world was a violent place. Men screamed and fell. Horses trampled them into the mud and then fell themselves, hamstrung or pierced by arrows. The ground ran thick with blood. Richard himself, still horsed, was laying about him right and left. His visor was raised, but I couldn't see his face. His golden crown glinted in the sunlight. Beside him, his own standard bearer, Sir Percival Thribbald, went down as his horse was cut from underneath him. Shouting, "The king lives! The king lives!" he struggled to his knees, keeping the white ball flying high, a rallying point for Richard's beleaguered forces. 3 men turned on him. At no time did he seek to defend himself, devoting all his efforts to keeping the